what we need is a revolution, and we cannot wait for the professionals to lead it. I think the community, patients, citizens that will lead it, but I have no doubt that professionals will join right away because they're also struggling, they're also suffering, they also want something better.
Thanks very much for joining us today. Before we begin, I would like to once again welcome our friend and colleague and program partner, Michael Giuliano. Michael is president of Planetree, which is a global not-for-profit organization dedicated to humanizing healthcare for everyone through excellence in person-centered care. Welcome, Michael.
Of course, and thank you, Chris, and welcome everyone to the June edition of the Humanizing Healthcare podcast. As Chris mentioned, my name is Michael Giuliano, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome our guest speaker today, who is Victor Montori. Victor is the co-founder and chair of the Patient Revolution, a fast-growing global movement for careful and kind care. He is a clinician, researcher, and healthcare innovator, and a practicing endocrinologist at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, and is the author of the book, We Revolt, which I highly recommend that you read after this podcast, which serves as the conceptual framework for the patient revolution. He's a frequent international speaker and has published more than 600 peer-reviewed papers. He's in the top 1% of the most frequently cited health service researchers in the world for his work on shared decision-making and minimally disruptive care. So with that, hopefully that creates an inspiring foundation and platform upon which we will launch this webinar today with Chris and Victor. Welcome.
And welcome, Victor. Thank you very much for joining us.
Delighted to be here, Chris and Michael. Thank you very much for that kind introduction.
You have had kind of a remarkable journey from growing up in Lima, Peru, to now being an endocrinologist and care activist at Mayo Clinic. Can you tell us the story of how that all came about and your path into healthcare? As
most things, it's easier to tell the story in retrospect, but I was born in Lima, grew up there in the midst of wonderful food and a great love of family, but also terrorism and hyperinflation. When I finished my medical school training, I had learned from American textbooks and journal articles, and I sort of knew what was appropriate and good care, but I couldn't practice it. Had the opportunity to pursue further training in the United States, and through the matching program by which hospitals find their interns and residents, I matched at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, where I've made a career after training in internal medicine and also endocrinology, also health services research. I've made a career here as a clinician and investigator taking care of patients with diabetes and conducting research in the care of patients with living with multiple chronic conditions.
Wow, that's great. Now, we understand that you founded Mayo Clinic's Knowledge and Evaluation Research Unit and are a chief investigator there. Can you tell us more about what that department does and what some of your activities there are?
The Knowledge and Evaluation Research Unit, or CARE unit, is a investigation-oriented group of friends and colleagues brought together by three principles: patient-centeredness. So we're not a disease-oriented group, but we're interested in investigating the care as experienced by patients, regardless of what condition is it that brings them into healthcare. The second value is integrity, which has a number of different manifestations, but perhaps most interesting has been, and most difficult, has been that we've never taken funding from any for-profit organization as a way of making sure that there's never an alternative financial explanation for the findings of our work. And the third principle is generosity, which ensures that we say yes to invitations before thinking of reasons to say no. These are invitations to collaborate, to work with others, to be a home for careers of young investigators. And we also, as part of this principle, make sure that the youngest, more juniorist person in our team gets the limelight when work is produced, so that they can advance their careers. Our unit is a transition point as people grow over time. And more recently, we added a fourth principle motivated by one of our colleagues' personal story of healthcare challenges, which is that we don't We don't conduct research that would not be considered impactful by those affected by disease or care. This year, the care unit is turning 20 years old. So in our annual meeting, which is in September, we will have a nice party to celebrate the fact that we've been together for 2 decades.
That's amazing. Can you tell us about some of the work that the team has engaged in there and some of the things that have come from it?
Yes, Chris, thank you. There are 4 sort of times, 4 sort of things that we've gone through. We started by looking at how knowledge is created and disseminated. How is it that we know what we know when it comes to the effectiveness of treatments and the accuracy of tests and so forth? In evidence-based medicine, this is the frame in which that work was conducted, there are 3 core principles. The first one is that you make decisions not based on the latest study, but on the body of evidence, that not all evidence is created equal, that some studies are more reliable and more trustworthy than others. And the third principle is that the evidence alone never tells you what to do, and that you have to consider the situation and the values and preferences of each patient. That pointed us into the second phase of our work, which was to figure out, okay, so how do we consider that patient circumstance? How do we consider those patient values and preferences informing plans of care? And that took us into shared decision making, which is a method of care based on conversations by which patients and clinicians collaborate to form plans of care that make intellectual, practical, and emotional sense to the patient. And in doing that, we recognize that patients living with not just one, but 2 or more chronic conditions, which happens to be the most common situation that brings people into ambulatory healthcare in the world, at least in the developed world, and that is a characteristic of the average American. The average American now lives with at least one chronic condition, and people over the age of 65 lives with 2 or more. That patients that accumulate chronic conditions have to consider not only what else they can do, but what they're already doing and how all that they're doing, plus the work that they have to do to gain access to care, to get the care that they need, to get insurance to approve things, that the wait times and other challenges. All that represents work, effort, and attention they have to dedicate to get the care that they need. And on top of that, they get homework. They have to do work of self-care that they have to implement in the context and routines of their lives. So all of that got us to thinking about the burden of all this care in people's lives, how that burden affects negatively the quality of life of patients, and how healthcare, by the way it's organized and delivered, and the way our treatments and tests and devices are designed, contributes to that suffering by increasing the burden of treatment, and how cruel we sometimes are when patients who are not able to mobilize resources to make all that work happen, and we're cruel by labeling them as non-compliant or non-adherent. And so all that work led us to call more than a decade ago for minimally disruptive care. So care that is designed to advance the patient's goals and priorities with the best available evidence, while at the same time minimizing the healthcare footprint that people have in their lives, that minimize that burden of treatment. So that's the third sort of phase of our work. There were a couple of other branches that I'm sure we're going to get to in a minute, but the latest phase now of our work has to do in part from fear, in part from curiosity. We're asking now the question, well, if care is the central thing, the central purpose of healthcare, and now we're bringing incredibly amazing technologies to bear, particularly artificial intelligence, how is it that artificial intelligence can be made to help with the work of care, both at the point of care and at the point of life? So we are developing now a program of work around the potential role either beneficial or potential harmful role of artificial intelligence in care.
Wow, that's quite a spectrum of things that you've looked at, from all the way from how do we generate knowledge to all the way how do we use artificial intelligence to manage it as well. Now, you've said on a number of occasions that we must transform healthcare from an industrial activity into a deeply human one. Tell us more about what you mean there and where it came from.
So Michael introducing me, talked about the healthcare industry, and that is a common phrase that people are using. You look at the GDP distribution and you see that we're investing, 17, 20% of our GDP into healthcare. So people see it as an economic sector ripe with opportunity for making money. And developing companies around it and so forth. But like education, healthcare is an investment. Healthcare is an investment that as a community we make in reducing the lid that is put on people's potential for flourishing by disease and disability and suffering. So we invest in healthcare so that people can not maybe limited to the least extent by these problems, and they can flourish hopefully to the complete extent of their potential. Education does the same thing, and the lid that is removed there is the lid of ignorance. These investments are essential if we want to have a society that enables the flourishing of everyone. Those who start off with more disadvantage because our societies are unfair and unjust, obviously benefit the most from those investments. That there are groups interested in extracting value from that investment for their particular profit is problematic. Because the effect of extracting value from that is to leave less of it to arrive at the point of care. Turns out that there are other mechanisms by which you can leave too little at the point of care, that beyond extracting value in for-profit healthcare industries. There's also the possibility that you have a publicly funded system that has chosen policies of austerity that are not investing enough in healthcare or in education, for that matter, offering too few resources at the point of care. And there's, of course, the possibility of corruption. So people are stealing from the system, and incompetence, where these precious resources, are misused, again, leaving very little resource at the point of care. So if you look globally at healthcare systems around the world, most healthcare systems have suffered one of these problems to the point where there are now few resources available for care at the point of care. This is where patients and clinicians come together to notice the challenges that the patient is experiencing and to respond to those challenges by co-creating plans of care that the patient will find acceptable, pertinent, and desirable. So the industrial process then uses the limited resources and focuses attention on providing access to it and reduce the cost of it. But as a result of the efforts focused on access and efficiency or value or to reduce cost, we forget what it is and we take it for granted. And as long as clinicians show up and patients need the service and work their way through to get it, then we are happy that we have a functional healthcare system, and we celebrate the occasional anecdote where someone who has been fixed or brought from the dead or rehabbed to full health. But the majority of patients who do not have a fixable condition, who need ongoing care, will continue to struggle with the healthcare system that processes them through rather than care for and about them, with clinicians that are being forced to work overclocked, multitasking, distracted, and pushed for time and efficiency, burning out and leaving care, creating more work for those who are left behind. So we have a problem where patients and families are overwhelmed by healthcare tasks, and clinicians are overwhelmed by the demands of healthcare that they cannot fulfill. A system that not only is environmentally unsustainable, producing 5% of greenhouse emissions and carbon into the atmosphere, a system that is not only financially unsustainable for many economies around the world, but also a system that fundamentally is humanly unsustainable, burning out patients and clinicians along the way without necessarily contributing to the extent that it could and it should to the flourishing of everyone that approaches it.
Wow. You mentioned how large a proportion of the gross domestic product of the United States is invested in healthcare. And do you think, and it's probably not a simple answer, but do you think that the industrialization and the extraction of value is why, or a major reason why we have to spend so much there and arguably do not necessarily end up with better care?
Yeah, the question is in fact broad because the question you're asking is what contributes to the healthcare inflation, and the optimistic answer is there is more and more we can do for people. And so it used to be that if you showed up with one of the chronic conditions that I've been talking about, there were only a handful of things we could offer you, and they were not very effective. They were not very expensive, but they were not very effective. So there was really nothing we could offer. I'm not that old, but I got trained at the time in Peru, where if you had a stroke, it took an act of Congress to get a CAT scan to see what your stroke looked like. But then what could you do about it was extremely limited. We didn't have any kind of tools to try to minimize the damage caused by the stroke, and very few resources to try to rehab you after that. That's not the case, right? We have now multiple treatments for multiple conditions. Each of those treatments is sometimes even more expensive than the one before, even though it may not be necessarily that much better. And as a result, because we have so much to offer you, and we tend to offer you most of it or all of it, the cost per patient to keep you well is pretty high. In the United States, we pay people like me, physicians, an obscene amount of money compared to the way we pay, for instance, teachers or other service providers in this form of investment in the care economy. While it's wonderful for people like me, it also is very problematic when we talk about a system that, again, takes about 20% of the GDP. It's very problematic to see within that system people at the front lines of care that are not rewarded economically or reputationally at the same level. You will remember, your listeners will remember of during COVID, how we went outside and banged pots and clapped and celebrated the essential workers, the care workers that were saving our lives and reminding us how interdependent we are, how dependent we are on the care work of others that we normally don't see, don't recognize, and don't reward. Most of them are women. Most of them are women of color. Many of them are immigrants. And that just tells you how lopsided that investment. So that's another contribution, that those who care the most are actually not getting paid. So where's the money going? And I think you start looking at the organizations that are reporting massive profits in the healthcare system, and that begins to offer you an evidence as to where the money is and is going. As companies are investing in healthcare on behalf of their employees, as families are paying premiums into private insurance providers, and those private insurers are offering insurance products both in the private space and as part of Medicare Advantage, and then reporting trillions of dollars of profit, then you begin to see where that money is going, and it is going to those investors that are backing those for-profit payers for the most part. Industry executives and physicians like me who are handsomely paid for the service that we provide. A lot of that money should not be going to any of those parties, but in fact should be directed to care. And I think if we did, we will recognize that we are actually have sufficient money to cover the needs not only of those who have access, but for everyone that is in the same geography as we are and lives with us.
Well put. Well put. Now, you have advocated for a patient revolution in care, and in fact, have started a nonprofit organization called the Patient Revolution. Is that part of the solution, that patients need to, undertake a revolution, or where do you think is the way forward? How can we address and impact this situation?
Some people think that I use the word revolution because, I don't know, it's cute or something, but I mean it. I think there's something fundamentally wrong with the way we structure this investment in each other. I think the idea that the best it can do is to assume that patients are interchangeable. That a patient with diabetes is a patient with diabetes, a patient with diabetes, that this is what you do to people like this one, and that the clinicians are interchangeable. It doesn't matter who you see. You saw one person the last time, you saw a different one. Who cares? They're all following the same protocol for people like you. Why does it matter? Do you care who the pilot is on the plane when you get on the plane? You get on the plane and the plane takes you where you go. And the pilot doesn't care who the passengers are. So that's all right. And unfortunately, that metaphor and other metaphors of that nature indicate that care is something that we can be satisfied when it is designed for people like us versus when it is for us. And I think that for things that we can fix, so I just recently had cataract surgery on my left eye. I don't think it mattered to my ophthalmologist who the carrier of the eyeball was. And I frankly wanted the surgery to be perfect, to go in, come out, my cataract removed and the eye seeing well. In that case, that I got processed through within 15 minutes, 30 minutes in and out, and I got a reliable surgery done well, done right the first time, great quality, great reliability. That's a plus. But it is in this other group of patients, those who we don't have anything to fix, but we're helping figure out plans of treatment that optimize the future for them while not fully interrupting or disrupting their lives today. That co-creation, that crafting of plans of care that are safe and effective for you, not for people like you, that see your situation, not just your biology, but also your biography, that sees you in high definition, that notices the aspects of your life that you've lived, that shape how you're experiencing the current symptoms, the aspects of your life now that you would like to prioritize, and you would prefer that treatment doesn't interfere or block or change, and how your life is affecting the safety and efficacy of the treatments that we're prescribing you, and how our treatments are affecting your ability to live your life. And then what are your goals and priorities towards the future, the things we have to work towards. That intersection between your life, not the life of people like you, but your life and your biology. How do we best respond to that? That is what care ought to be about. And the systems find that profoundly inefficient. And they would like to for us to accelerate that, process people through a little faster, so we can open up access, so there will be more people going through it, and keep the costs down. And that is not capable of fulfilling the investment that we make as a society in healthcare. It doesn't put care at the center of what we're trying to do. And it gets away with it as we lower our expectations of what we need. That needs to fundamentally change. The word revolution is turning. All the older people know that you will buy your LPs and it will say, 33 RPM. Those are revolutions per minute. So it's turning, right? And I think it's time for us to turn away from that industrialized model towards a model capable of careful and kind care for everyone. If it was reform, if it was innovation, all that we needed, I think we would be there. Because we have a very vibrant sector. There's a lot of innovation coming to it. There's a lot of smart and creative professionals coming to it. But it's striking. When I present the case to professionals, to healthcare professionals, there are two reactions that are stereotypical. Yes, you're right. We all want that. And the second reaction is, but we cannot change it. And so there's a learned helplessness in this system among people who the patients think have all the power, who actually find themselves unable to shape what they do every day, to actually meet the reason why they went into healthcare in the first place, which is to care for patients. So what we need is a revolution, and we cannot wait for the professionals to lead it. It will be, I think, the community, patients, citizens that will lead it. But I have no doubt that professionals will join right away because they're also struggling, they're also suffering, they also want something better.
Yeah, I think you touched on a number of things that we talk about on this program quite often. And one of them is relationships. That I think the industrial approach to things is very transactional, and it presumes that people are products or widgets and that we simply need to move them through in a transactional, scalable, efficient way. But the reality is that we're not products, and that those relationships are really important, not only to the patient, whether it's for cataract surgery or for your annual wellness visit, but they're also equally important to the care providers as well, because that's where they get that emotional fuel that makes them know that they're making a difference for people. And so that I think is a big part of what you're describing.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Chris. I think that that is what I'm describing, and I think that if you talk about the unsustainable system, you have to think about also, okay, what would make it sustainable? And I think in economics, we have seen that for the longest time, all the graphs in economics ignored where the resources were coming in, the natural resources coming into the economy to create value, and where the trash, where the exhaust was going to. They never drew the planet as part of the economic model. And as a result, for the longest time, they talked about externalities, things that were outside the system, until now, of course, ignoring the reality that we're exploiting nature without replenishing it, without rewilding it, was going to come back to bite us. And we are at the door of global heating with a new class of human, the climate migrant, the climate refugee, affecting the functioning of healthcare systems everywhere. So we're going to have not only pandemics, but this other problem to deal with, in addition to the crisis of chronic conditions. So we better hurry up with this revolution, otherwise we're not going to be able to care for people. But similarly, the other resource necessary for care is the resource of time, energy, attention of the clinician and the patient working together to form plans of care. And by exploiting that and without replenishing it, we're creating a problem of human sustainability. And the key thing that we discover when we look at care carefully is that care is a renewable source. It's a renewable resource. If we don't exploit it, if we cultivate it, if we make it the most important thing in healthcare, you will see what we all saw. The most moving image during the pandemic was that of the patient that was wheeled out of the hospital after spending weeks in intensive care unit intubating, probably not going to make it, probably going to make it, family on the edge, the healthcare professionals on the edge. Finally, the patient makes it, and we're going to wheel him out. And you see the corridors line up of the nurses and the therapists and the physicians that participate in this man's care. And they're all clapping, and this guy is coming out. And that renewed everyone's commitment to go back to the bedside and care for the next patient. Care is a renewable resource if we put it at the center of what we do.
That's great. That's great explanation. How do we engage the practicing provider and mid-level management in engaging in grassroots change? They are having a focus so much on day-to-day tasks that I fear we're only getting more lopsided.
Yeah, and I think people focus on what leadership tells them is the most important thing. We have limited resources by the time it comes to care, and we have a big mission. So it is natural that those who are at the front lines focus on making care happen. But turns out that many of us are also professionals. We're not technicians. We're not there to execute on plans. We're also to think about the downstream consequences of our actions and make sure that we create the conditions for care. So it is our responsibility not only to care, but also to make sure that we have conditions for care. And as we become leaders, as we initially managers, but have leadership position in organizations, our first job is to make sure that there are appropriate conditions for care. Some of those conditions are material. We need to have adequate facilities. We need to have adequate tools and equipment. But we also need to make sure that we pay attention to the most important resource that we have, which is attention. So we need to have quiet. We need to have time. We need to have, and so that has to do with scheduling. That has to do with staffing. That has to do. One of my favorite slides to show these days when I give presentations is a picture of the floor where I work in the 18th floor of the Mayo Clinic building. It's a 1950s building. The floor is made of tiles made of cork. And that was a deliberate choice to reduce the noise from the corridor that could filter into the office, because people understood when they were making that choice that what was happening in the office was sacred and needed to be protected from outside noise. Similarly, the doors are thick, protecting the privacy of what's happening in that office from the passersby on the corridor. These sorts of decisions that have economic implications, have costs to them, indicate and demonstrate to future generations, 50, 60, 70 years later, what mattered to those people who were setting up that particular building for care. So when we get to leadership positions, we have to remember that the core thing that we have to do in that position is we need to cultivate care. We need to create conditions for care. We cannot mandate flowers to bloom. We can only make sure that the soil is right, that the light is appropriate, that there's enough water. We want to talk to the darn plant, but we cannot command the flower to bloom. Similarly, we have to create the conditions for care, material, emotional, spiritual, even moral and organizational conditions for care in which our clinicians and our patients can do the best job. And then hold leaders accountable for creating those conditions. Right now, that accountability arrow is switched. We have managers holding clinicians accountable for the care they're delivering. It's the opposite. Or those managers, their role is to create the conditions, and patients and clinicians need to turn to those managers there and demand that they create conditions for them to care well.
What are your thoughts on how technology in healthcare is impacting our ability to humanize care? And then how do you feel EHRs and data are helping humanization? As nurses, they often feel that standardization is turning us into robot mode, and she worries about where that will be even 10 years from now. So can technology play a role in this?
Yeah, I'm very worried about technology, because if you decide that you are in industrialization mode, then the technology will be designed and implemented to achieve the industrial goal. So if the goal is to process people through, the technology will make sure that you do so with the high industrial standards. And what is necessary for that? A very high level of documentation to secure whatever billing is necessary, because of course there's people obfuscating the disbursement of resources by demanding greater and greater levels of documentation. Of course, some people then see that technology, particularly large language models and artificial intelligence, coming in to relieve frontline clinicians from the demand of documentation, creating automated documentation that then can be used to command higher levels of reimbursement. And that's the value proposition, both the well-being of clinicians and the higher level of reimbursement that many of those companies that are coming into that space. And then, of course, there'll be the insurers, large language models that will be reading those notes and determining if the level of documentation is sufficient to provide the reimbursement. And then, of course, those large language model bots are going to need large language model AI bot supervisors that are going to make sure that they're doing all of a sudden, we're going to create a synthetic system, an artificial system of constant checks and balances that ensure that the machine works with the highest level of efficiency. Where are the humans in all this? Well, if done right, technology can really move all these things aside and enable the core function of healthcare to happen, which is only something that humans can do. Machines can imitate it, but I think we need to come to terms as something that we'll have to do over the next couple of decades, I think. come to terms with what we think is appropriate and authentic in terms of care. And I think I'm of the particular notion that we should demand that care be human, even when technology delivered care can appear to be better, even more empathic. I think that we must insist that our care, when possible, be done by other people. But we can discuss that. So I find that we could imagine using the technology to actually create the space, reduce the clutter, improve the conditions for care. But there are concerns. So, for instance, if the computer is going to create my note, then something will give. Last time I was in clinic, last afternoon, I had a patient that I didn't know exactly what was going on. When I was writing my note, I came up with some potential things that I had not thought about when I was with the patient in the office that we may want to explore further. The opportunity to synthesize and to figure out what I was thinking when I was writing, so not simply document my thoughts, but also continue to think while producing. Anybody that has written anything will know that you sometimes find out what you're thinking when you have to write it. And so that process now is going to be taken over by the machine. Would that in some way reduce our ability to remember a patient, to think through their situation, to come up with new ways of diagnosing and treatment? I do not know. That's why I mentioned at the front of our conversation that our research unit is exploring actively how these new and evolving technologies can contribute to care, but also how they can take away.
That's fantastic. But I would like to go to our usual final question and just ask is, do you have a favorite quote you can share? And if so, why is it your favorite quote? And any parting advice you may have for our audience on this important topic we've been discussing?
Before I do that, Chris, which I will get to in a second, but I think I want to invite people to come to the Patient Revolution website and look at our school. We have an online course. It's free. It's participatory, but it's also asynchronous, so you can participate anytime from anywhere in the world. It's called the Foundations for Careful and Kind Care, and I will invite you to go through the course. Find out that you're not crazy. There are other people like you that feel that care needs to be the fundamental thing, and we need to turn away from industrial healthcare into careful and kind care. We're expanding that course now to include leaders. So we have a program coming out for boards of hospitals so that we can actually help those in charge of and with a fiduciary responsibility of running healthcare to know and remind themselves that the fundamental goal of healthcare is to care. And so we have those opportunities. And so people should come in and join our fellowship. We have fellows from all over the world, from 6 continents, that are conducting activities everywhere, small mini revolts that we're putting together in a community that is fundamentally changing healthcare. So that's my invitation to engage with us. And perhaps Why We Revolt, the book, might be helpful to you. So engage with this and see if this can bring to what you do in healthcare a new lens and a new way of thinking and doing. It all may sound very utopic, and it may not feel like it's feasible to make this change. And this is where my favorite quote comes in, Chris. It's from Galeano, a Uruguayan writer who tells his story. It's not a quote; it's a brief story. He is in Colombia at a meeting with some filmmakers, and a kid from the audience, a student from the audience, asked one of the Argentinian filmmakers, "Why do we need utopias?" And the filmmaker basically explains that the utopias are like the horizon. You take a couple of steps towards the horizon, and the horizon takes a couple of steps back. You take 10 steps towards the horizon takes 10 steps back. You run towards the horizon, and the horizon runs back as much as you did. So why do we need utopias? For that, for walking. And I think knowing that we want careful and kind care for all is animating all of us to take steps today to make that a reality. Perhaps not for us, but at least for the people that come after us, so they can have flourishing lives because of the investments that we make in education and healthcare for them.
May we all continue to seek that utopia on the horizon and follow the revolution towards more relational and less transactional, more human and less industrial care. Victor, I can't thank you enough for your time and insights today. I think I have a much better idea now of what you mean when you call yourself a care activist. I have seen it firsthand now. For our listeners, thank you for joining us as well. We hope you found this discussion informing and inspiring. If you just enjoyed this discussion, please subscribe so you never miss a future episode. And be sure to join us for our next Humanizing Healthcare discussion. We'll be talking with Sven Gerlinger, Chief Experience Officer at Northwell Health. It will be a great discussion. Thanks very much and have a terrific rest of your day.